I'm very excited to be here today that I got the invitation from Tommy and his colleagues to share a little bit about the research that we're doing at Georgia Tech and in the area of expanding the color palette of electrochromic polymers. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today here as I pull up my screen for you. So the goal of my presentation today is to give a little bit of scientific background into how we're planning on expanding this color palette and some of the design rules that we use to bring some more color into this field. So without further ado then, I'm also going to give my sort of take on the background here and sort of what we think about when we're designing colors. And if we think about what an electrochromic device actually is, it's simply a dynamic color filter. And that's what the cartoon is showing here on the bottom here, then the electrochromic device here on the left that you can see here. And so the way a color filter works is that it contains a material that will absorb very specific wavelengths of light. And so in the example that I'm showing here, where we have this magenta filter, it's a filter that absorbs specifically green light and lets blue and red light through it. And so then when we're the observer looking at this filter, we're looking at this electrochromic device then, we're only going to see a mixture of the blue and the red light coming through the filter. And so our eye is going to observe it as being this sort of pink or purple color. And so really what we're doing at Georgia Tech then is designing molecules where we control what wavelengths of light that they absorb and what wavelengths of light that they transmit. Now, the difference then in our case, when we have this technology, as I said, it's a dynamic device, which is what Carlo just gave an excellent overview of. And so we can actually then also turn this color filter off. I'm going to take these off too. And what happens when we, as Carlos mentioned then, these are coupled to a power source, they're electrically driven. And so as we're powering this device then, what happens to the materials we design that are inside here is that we begin removing electrons from our electrochromic material. And in our case, it does a lot of different things to our material, but one thing that it does is that it changes the conformation of the molecule or the electrochromic material. And that's why what I'm showing here on the bottom with this schematic of this spring here. So what we can imagine is that when our polymer or our electrochromic material is in the colored state where it's absorbing light, we have a spring that's coiled. And it's coiled in a very specific way, which means that it's absorbing the green light and letting the blue and the red light pass through it. But then when we begin removing electrons, what happens is that we're changing the conformation. And so in our case, we're uncoiling this spring. And at Georgia Tech, what we are doing then is we're making the second conformation such that it transmits all visible light. So now we can have all the wavelengths going through, which means our eyes will see it as a transmissive or clear device. Carlos also highlighted a lot of the examples. This is certainly not a new technology. You can find it in cars and in the Boeing Dreamliner and multiple buildings across the US, one of which is on Georgia Tech campus. But what we're really trying to do at Tech is to bring some color into this field, because as you can see here, there's a lot of blue happening. And so we think that we have an excellent way to expand the color palette. And the way we do that, or the way we're proposing to do it, is to use electrochromic polymers. And there's multiple reasons why we're interested in using polymers specifically, but one of them is that we have exceptional color control. So there's a lot of synthetic flexibility that we have to tune the color of these materials. We're also working hard on making them soluble so that we can make inks. It's a thin film technology, and there's some advantages to that. One of them being that we can make them switch fairly rapidly, which I hope you can see on the bottom here, which was one of our little demo device we made a long time ago now, that switches from purple to clear, and you can see it switching. I think that's 1/4 of a second switch there on the right-hand side. Okay, so why are we using polymers? Well, polymers are large molecules. This is just a schematic showing a polymer. It's not what our materials look like specifically, but they have the similarity that they are large molecules. And that means that there's a lot of parts on this molecule that we can change out. And in that way, change how this material interacts with light. And so, for example, if we're looking to make a small color change, we could imagine doing something very simple. We could maybe take the green balls here and replace them with red balls. Now, if you look at the molecule as a whole, this is a fairly small change. We've only changed three balls there. And as a result, the color change that we observe then is going to be subtle. And to me, a subtle color change would be, for instance, having a material that's vibrantly yellow and can switch to clear, to changing the conformation of the molecule to make it appear orange. Now, sometimes, obviously, we might want to make a much larger color change than this. And then we have to look back on our molecule and make, obviously, a much larger change to the structure. And so then it usually isn't enough to just change a small part of the molecule. We're going to have to do something a little bit more drastic here. And so, for example, one thing we could do is to take the polymer backbone itself and actually take out every other gray ball and make that a green ball instead. So now it's a new molecule. And then we're going to see a much larger color change. So in this case, an example would be that we start off with something that's yellow to clear, and by changing out some of these, every other unit, we're going to have something that's now cyan to clear. So a completely different color. And this is something that we've done at Georgia Tech over many years now. And this is just one example that you see on the top of one of our electrochromic rainbows that we've developed. And so you can see, using this strategy of just changing how it's coiled and how these molecules interact with light, we've been able to create a huge number of colors. Now, what's really cool, in my opinion, with our approach is that if you look more closely at the structures, which I'm showing there on the bottom, beneath all these photographs, if you look at these, you're going to see something that they all have in common, and that is this dioxythiophene core, and that's what I'm showing here on the bottom left. So you will see this motif throughout all these polymers. Now, why is that nice? Well, it means that we're using very similar building blocks to build these large molecules, and so it makes our synthesis modular. And what do I mean by that? Well, it means that we can use very similar recipes to make all these different colors. We can use very similar reaction conditions. We can use similar purification methods when we make these different colors. And that makes the synthesis fairly straightforward, and it also makes it scalable. And what I mean by scalable is that the recipes that we develop at Georgia Tech, and when we're making materials, we might make them on a very small scale, something like a gram. But if your synthesis is scalable, it means that you should be able to give your recipe to a company then. They should be able to recreate these materials and have them perform exactly the same way, but make much larger batches of them. And that's very important if we want to move this technology ahead. As I mentioned briefly there earlier on, is that we can make inks. And so we worked over the last few years, especially at Georgia Tech, very hard on really optimizing and enhancing solubility of these large molecules. And the reason we're doing that is because if we can make these large molecules soluble, we can make electrochromic inks. And if you can make electrochromic inks, you can start printing these things or using coding methods that are available in the industry already. And so here are some examples of different coding methods you could use for these polymers that we've designed. So you could just go to the art store and buy an airbrush spray gun. You can spray them. You might use an inkjet printer, or you might do something a little bit more fancy that most of us don't have at home, which is, for example, slot die coating. And by optimizing and making sure these polymers are very soluble, they will be compatible with all of these different coating methods, which is really pretty cool, I think. Another thing that's pretty interesting and neat with these materials is that you need very little of a material to get a very vibrant color. So what you can see here in this slot die coated thin film here, that's on the order of 200 to 300 nanometers thick. So it's a very, very thin film, yet the color is really vibrant. And what that means is that you need very, very little material to actually make large area coatings. And so my colleague recently did a back of the envelope calculation and came to the conclusion that if we would make electrochromic coatings on every single window in the Empire State Building, it would only take 20 pounds of one of these polymers. And in my opinion, 20 pounds isn't that much. It's like, I guess, 9 kilos. So really something that we don't need a lot of material to make, to get pretty colors. Another thing that's pretty neat when you have something that's an ink and that's soluble is that you don't necessarily have to make a new color every time you want a very specific hue. We can just mix colors together, which is what I'm showing on the bottom, just like you would mix paint or watercolors. And so one student was interested in recreating Coke Red. The reason being that the Coca-Cola headquarters is Georgia Tech's neighbors. That was one of the reasons we did that. But we measured we determined what shade of red Coke Red was. And the student then realized that if he takes a little bit of pink and a little bit of our yellow and mix them in just the right ratios, we can recreate that color perfectly. Another thing you might want to do, you can toss in some cyan into the mix. And so yellow, magenta, and cyan makes black, which is how printers work. So we can mix those together and get a black ink, or maybe we could even consider which one of our colleagues did, was that you can just print them in layers on top of each other to get a black color where you're, which is what you can see there on this butterfly pattern on the bottom. Now, another thing that we did, we were looking to make browns, and brown is surprisingly difficult to make as a color. And what we were interested in doing in this particular instance was to make electrochromic sunglasses. And so what we did here was we took a pair of sunglasses that we could just buy in the store, and we had determined what shade of brown they were. And then we looked at the color and looked at the spectrum, and we're able to see that, okay, if we take a little bit of our orange polymer and mix in a little bit of the blue, we're going to be able to recreate again that shade perfectly. And that's what we did here, which is what I'm showing here. On the bottom, we have this sort of purple brown colored lens. And we were able to switch this lens between a brown color and a clear state using just a small coin cell battery that was put into the back of the frame. And that's really another thing that I do want to highlight, which is what Carlos already showed with the little cute lemon battery, is that these really do not require much power at all to switch between the colored and the clear state. We can use a simple small coin cell battery. We can even use a little printed solar cell. So really not something that's going to be power intensive at all. And with that, I've been very fortunate over the last few years at Georgia Tech to meet a lot of very interesting people and a lot of creative people who have had amazing ideas about the kind of applications that you could use these for. And so certainly if any of you out there can think of a very cool application that you'd want something to switch from color to clear, please do send me an email or find me on LinkedIn. I'm always very excited to hear about new ideas and new applications that we haven't thought of yet.